They say the mind is a fortress, solid, unbreachable, sovereign. But in the winter of 1824, that illusion was shattered. Entire families in Hadley, Massachusetts, 17 households rose from their tables, left warm fires burning in their hearths, left their livestock unfed, their doors unbarred, and vanished into the wilderness. No screams, no struggle, no signs of violence. They simply walked, as though summoned by a voice that no one else could hear. And the only name whispered by the ones who dared remain behind was Ezekiel Drummond. Drummond was not a preacher, nor a soldier, nor a man of wealth. He was something far more dangerous. A teacher, a professor who understood, better than anyone of his time, the fragile machinery of the human will. His colleagues saw brilliance, his students saw revelation, but his neighbors, they saw something else. They saw men transformed into shadows of themselves, their confidence replaced by obedience, their laughter by silence, their eyes carrying the same silvered vacancy as their masters. When the constables finally entered Drummond's home, they expected a madman's scribbles, or perhaps a chemist's bottles of poison. What they found was infinitely more disturbing. Shelf after shelf of journals, not his, but theirs. The private writings of boys and men, dissected, catalogued, annotated in a hand that moved with both precision and obsession. It was not knowledge he sought, it was possession. He wasn't content to study the human mind. He wanted to break it, reshape it, command it. The newspapers called it hysteria. The officials called it migration. But the survivors of Hadley knew. They knew they had lived in the presence of a man science could not explain. A man whose voice could bend thought, whose gaze could pierce conscience, whose will could overwrite your own without you even realizing it was happening. Tonight, you will step into the silence he left behind. You will see how the walls of human identity can be torn down brick by brick, and how Ezekiel Drummond discovered a system of control so complete, so devastating, that it still echoes through the institutions of today. This is not just history. This is the forbidden architecture of power itself. And once you hear it, you will never look at your own mind the same way again. Imagine a man stripped not of his clothes or his flesh, but of his choices. That is what Ezekiel Drummond perfected. Not a whip, not a chain, not a prison. His tool was conversation. His stage, the classroom. Students would arrive full of themselves, sons of merchants, heirs to farms, boys with futures already sketched out by fathers and pastors. They would sit across from Drummond, laughing, sneering, skeptical. Within weeks, their laughter would vanish. Their confidence would soften. Their voices would drop into quiet murmurs. And then, one by one, they would begin to write. It started with simple prompts. Describe the happiest day of your life. What do you fear most? What would you give up to protect your family? Innocent questions, or so they seemed. But Drummond's genius was not in the asking. It was in the way he fed back their answers. He would twist them, sharpen them, mirror them in ways that exposed every weakness. A boy's pride became vanity, his faith hypocrisy, his love for his parents a leash. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The journals became confessions, and the confessions became contracts. Every vulnerability mapped, every secret weaponized, until Drummond knew them better than they knew themselves. To disobey him was not simply to defy authority, it was to expose one's own soul to ridicule, to collapse under the unbearable weight of truth. Neighbors noticed the change. One farmhand's gait grew stilted, as if he marched to unheard commands. Another stopped sleeping in his family home and instead stood night after night outside Drummond's gate, waiting for orders. And then there were the women, the mothers, the sisters, the wives who begged their men to leave his classes. But their pleas met only with hollow stares. Once the seed was planted, the soil of their minds belonged to him. What terrified the town most was not what Drummond said. It was the silence he created. Men would sit for hours with him. No words exchanged, just a gaze steady, relentless. And when they finally rose to leave, they were altered. They could not describe it. They could not explain it. They only knew they would return. This was no ordinary schooling. It was a dismantling, a ritual undoing of selfhood. And those who entered Drummond's circle soon carried that vacancy with them, infectious, unshakable, spreading through Hadley like a plague of obedience. At first, it was subtle. A husband forgetting to close the barn. A mother staring too long into the fire. A boy who once whistled at dawn now sitting wordless on the porch, staring at the road that led to Drummond's house. But soon the fractures widened. What began with the students bled into their homes, and what was once private unease became a contagion that devoured families whole. Neighbors whispered that Drummond's pupils were carrying something back into their houses, not ideas, but absence. Fathers stopped leading prayers at the table. Sons withdrew from chores, their hands raw but idle. Wives found themselves speaking into silence, their words bouncing back like echoes in a cavern. The family hearth, once the center of warmth and order, grew cold. Not because fires weren't lit, but because no one cared to tend them. One by one, the rhythms of Hadley faltered. Farmers missed harvests though their fields stood ready. Cattle wandered unfed. Babies went unrocked in their cradles while mothers sat with eyes fixed on some invisible point. And when neighbors tried to intervene, they were met with the same gray, vacant gaze, the Drummond stare. Entire households began walking away. Not at night, not with secrecy, but in daylight, as though nothing were strange. A family of 6 left their bread half-kneaded, the dough hardening in the bowl, as they walked into the woods without shoes. Another was found wandering the frozen banks of the Connecticut River, murmuring phrases no one could understand. No resistance, no rebellion, no explanation. Just submission to a call only they could hear. Panic swept through the town. Reverend Moses Kingsley thundered from his pulpit that it was the devil's work. Reverend O'Brien whispered it was possession. Mothers gathered in circles of prayer. Fathers oiled their muskets. Children cried themselves to sleep. But none of it mattered. Guns could not shoot an idea. Prayers could not bind a voice that was already inside the mind. The constables tried to question Drummond. They found him in his study, calm, collected, polite. He denied everything. And when they left, one of the constables returned the next night on his own, knocking at Drummond's door, begging for private instruction. The infection was not in the town's food, nor its water. It was in the structure of influence itself. And once a man surrendered to it, his household soon followed. Hadley was no longer a community. It was becoming a hive, and Drummond stood at its center. By December of 1824, the town elders could no longer ignore it. 17 households gone, dozens more hollowed out. The academy, once Hadley's pride, had become a fortress of silence and strange devotion. Whispers reached the governor's office in Boston. Something unnatural was happening in the valley, and it had a name, Ezekiel Drummond. So the constables returned, this time not with questions but with orders. They were sent to dismantle the academy, seize the professor's papers, and escort him to Northampton for inquiry. They expected resistance, maybe even madness. What they found instead was civility. Drummond welcomed them at the door, his silver-flecked eyes steady, his voice calm. He offered tea. He offered cooperation. And within an hour, the men who had come to silence him were nodding at his words. Their anger softened into something that looked disturbingly like admiration. The records say the raid failed because of insufficient evidence. But those who lived through it knew better. The men charged with arresting Drummond emerged from his study pale, sweating, and silent. They carried no papers, confiscated no journals, and within days, several of them resigned their posts. One moved his family out of Hadley entirely. Another was seen standing motionless at the edge of Drummond's property, whispering into the cold wind until dawn. The town's faith in its leaders collapsed. If the law could not touch him, who could? Reverend Kingsley declared it judgment from God. Reverend O'Brien more quietly called it a test. But the people saw only one truth. The structures meant to protect them were bending, one by one, toward the man at Elm Street. Authority was not his enemy, it was his prey. And this is where the unease deepened into terror. Because Drummond's power was not spectacle. He performed no rituals, called down no demons, brandished no threats. His influence was invisible, psychological, inescapable. You could not point to it, you could not prove it, but once it touched you, it rewired you. And when the men of law themselves bent under his gaze, the town realized the unthinkable. The machinery of society could be dismantled not with violence, but with influence. Not by killing the body, but by rewriting the will. This was no longer about Hadley. This was a demonstration. A warning to anyone who believed power rested in pulpits, courtrooms, or assemblies. Power belonged to whoever could command the invisible strings of thought itself. And Drummond had learned how to pull them. By the turn of the year, Hadley was no longer just a town in decline, it was a contagion spreading through the Connecticut River Valley. Families from nearby Northampton, Amherst, even Springfield began reporting the same strange silences, the same hollow stares, the same compulsions to wander into the night without reason. They had no direct contact with Drummond, and yet the current carried outward, as if proximity alone was enough to infect entire households. Merchants whispered that their clerks no longer cared for coin. Farmers muttered that their sons abandoned plows in the furrows. Mothers wept as daughters refused meals, sitting instead in window light, eyes fixed on the road that led north to Hadley. And when pressed, these wanderers spoke the same words. The professor knows. That was the horror of it, he did not need to touch every life personally. His students, already broken and remade, carried his imprint outward like missionaries of absence. Wherever they walked, they spread not sermons but silence, not teachings but surrender. It was not ideology, it was infection. And the more it spread, the more indistinguishable its victims became. A merchant in Springfield looked exactly like a farmer in Hadley. The same empty half-smile, the same pale eyes, the same willingness to walk away from everything without a second thought. The valley's leaders began to meet in secret. Ministers debated exorcism. Physicians whispered of madness in the blood. Magistrates spoke of shutting Hadley's borders. But none could agree on a cause, let alone a cure. For what they faced was not cholera, not fever, not famine. It was influence pure, corrosive, and unstoppable. Travelers began to avoid the town altogether. Peddlers refused to set foot near its streets. Caravans detoured miles out of their way rather than risk passing its borders. Hadley, once prosperous, had become a forbidden zone. Yet those who lived within its shadow could not stay away. Drawn by some unseen gravity, they drifted toward Elm Street, compelled like moths circling a flame they could not comprehend. Extinction did not come with fire or flood. Came with stillness. Houses stood empty, fields untended, prayers unanswered. The valley was unraveling, and at its center stood Ezekiel Drummond, not with armies, not with wealth, but with something far more dangerous, an idea strong enough to erase the very instinct of survival. Drummond's study was not a place of clutter, nor chaos. It was a cathedral of order. The townsmen who entered expecting madness found something far more unsettling. Precision. 12 oak shelves lined the walls, stacked not with dusty tomes, but with journals, hundreds of them, each bound in rough leather, each tagged with a name. Not Drummond's name, not his words, but the words of others, his students, his neighbors, his prey. Each journal was more than a diary. They were maps. He had dissected them line by line, cataloging fears, cataloging shames, cataloging hungers no one dared confess aloud. He circled words in red ink: father, guilt, desire, failure. In the margins, he wrote not comments but commands. Short phrases, each one like a blade. Press here. Withhold approval. Apply silence. What emerged was not education but experimentation. He had learned the delicate levers of human identity, the praise that inflated, the pause that shattered, the silence that enslaved. Every man had a weakness, a fault line in the stone of his mind. And Drummond had made it his craft to find it, widen it, and collapse the structure entirely. Witnesses later described the journals as blueprints of submission. One revealed how a young heir from Boston, proud and arrogant, was reduced to obedience in 6 weeks. Another tracked the collapse of a devout farm boy, broken by the suggestion that his prayers were selfish. Each case ended the same. the subject no longer thinking his own thoughts, but echoing Drummond's rhythms, his cadence, his silence. Most chilling of all was the final shelf. Those journals bore no names on their spines, only numbers. Inside, the handwriting was not youthful, but adult men from Hadley itself. Fathers, magistrates, even clergy. Somehow, their words had found their way into Drummond's collection, their secrets harvested, their wills dismantled. The infection had leapt the boundary of the classroom into the very bones of the town. This was no mere scholar's work. This was the architecture of obedience, a forbidden science of psychological control. Where others saw the mind as mystery, Drummond saw machinery. And with the precision of a surgeon, he had learned how to cut wires, reroute currents, and reprogram human beings into empty vessels. It was here, in this room, that the real terror emerged. The realization that no one was immune. Not the young, not the old, not even the men who believed themselves masters of law, of scripture, of reason. Drummond had built a system that reduced them all to clay in his hands. It was inevitable. A sickness this visible, this corrosive, could not spread unchecked without sparking resistance. By January, Hadley's remaining citizens gathered in barns, cellars, and church basements. Farmers, preachers, mothers, anyone who still clung to the old rhythms of life came together with a single purpose: to end Ezekiel Drummond's hold. They spoke of fire, of storming the academy, of tearing down his home brick by brick, of dragging him to the river and drowning him like a witch. The rage was raw, the fear palpable. For a moment, it seemed the town had rediscovered its will. Torches were lit. Muskets were loaded. The mob surged down King Street, a river of fury heading straight for Elm Street. But Drummond was waiting, not with weapons, not with soldiers, with words. He stepped onto his porch as if expecting them, his silver eyes sweeping across the crowd. He did not shout. He did not plead. He simply spoke in that measured voice, low and steady, the same tone he used with students behind closed doors. Witnesses swore they could not recall the words themselves, only the feeling that followed. The torches lowered. The muskets wavered. Men who had sworn to burn him alive found their rage dissolving into confusion, then into shame. Some dropped their weapons entirely. Others fell to their knees, trembling, as though suddenly aware of secrets they had long buried. It was only then that the townspeople realized the trap. Drummond had already harvested their confessions. He knew their shames, their betrayals, their hidden sins. And now, with the precision of a surgeon, he spoke just enough to expose them publicly, mercilessly. A farmer's adultery revealed. A deacon's theft unmasked. A mother's whispered wish that her child had never been born. Each truth landed like a blow, not from Drummond's hand, but from their own guilt turned against them. The mob dissolved, not in blood, but in humiliation. Men staggered home broken, women wept, children watched their protectors collapse. That night, no house in Hadley slept. The would-be rebels had discovered the cruelest truth of all. Resistance was not outside his design, it was part of it. Every rebellion, every outburst of rage, every whisper of defiance had already been written in those journals. Anticipated, prepared for, neutralized. Drummond did not need to crush rebellion. He only needed to let men reveal themselves, and they would crush one another. After the failed rebellion, Hadley was no longer simply a town under siege. It was a congregation, and Drummond, though he never claimed the title, stood at its pulpit. His house became a place of pilgrimage. Not just students, not just townsmen, but families, whole families came to him in silence, waiting on his steps as if the man inside were not mortal, but divine. The shift was subtle, then absolute. He never called himself a prophet, never invoked God's name. Yet his presence carried a gravity greater than any sermon, any scripture. Men who once knelt in church now knelt before his door. Women whispered his words to one another like scripture. Children, too young to understand, mimicked the stillness of his followers. Their play replaced by silence, their laughter abandoned. There were no hymns, no altars, no prayers. And yet something deeper than religion had taken root. Drummond did not offer salvation, he offered exposure. He revealed the hidden weaknesses each person thought secret, and in stripping them bare, he created a new kind of belonging. No man could lie in his presence. No woman could pretend virtue. Before Drummond, masks fell, and in that nakedness, his followers mistook their humiliation for truth. The academy itself became less a school than a temple. Students no longer studied to learn, but to dissolve. Their journals were no longer academic exercises, but confessions, acts of sacrifice, each page peeling away the layers of identity until only obedience remained. To outsiders, it looked like madness. To those within, it was transcendence. And then came the rituals, not commanded by Drummond, but invented by his disciples. They stood in silence for hours outside his home, faces turned toward his window. They abandoned meals, sleep, and work, all for the chance to hear him speak a single sentence. And when he did, his words were repeated endlessly, carried from mouth to mouth, transformed into mantras. Hadley's churches emptied. The bells tolled, but no one came. Reverend Kingsley delivered sermons to vacant pews. Reverend O'Brien wept as his flock dwindled into nothing. The people had not abandoned faith, they had redirected it. What had once been given to God was now absorbed by the professor with silver eyes and a voice that bent wills like iron made soft in fire. By the spring of 1825, Ezekiel Drummond was no longer just a man. In the valley's whispers, he was something more, an oracle of submission, a prophet of silence. Word of Hadley's collapse could no longer be contained. Farmers abandoning fields, churches emptied, entire households wandering into the forests and never returning. By the spring of 1825, whispers reached Boston, and with them, alarm. But the state did not send soldiers this time. They sent scholars, physicians, men of science, cloaked in the authority of reason, determined to explain and cure the sickness of the valley. They arrived in Hadley with notebooks, quills, and the arrogance of men certain that knowledge was defense enough. They examined the students, questioned the families, and sketched charts of symptoms. Some called it shared melancholia. Others, induced mania. A few whispered of mesmerism, that strange new European practice of unseen influence. But all agreed, the center of the contagion was Ezekiel Drummond. So they visited him, and that was their mistake. Drummond welcomed them with the same calm he had shown the constables. He listened to their theories with interest, nodding, inviting debate. He let them speak, then unraveled them with questions so simple they cut like knives. What is reason, if not habit? What is freedom, if your choices can be predicted? What is truth, if confession can be compelled? One by one, the doctors faltered. They came to study him, but found themselves confessing instead. Their quills scribbled furiously, but not observations, admissions. Secrets spilled. A scholar's affair with his student, a physician's theft from hospital coffers, a clergyman's collapse of faith. Each revelation was harvested, stored, and reflected back until the men were no longer scientists, but patients. No longer examiners, but disciples. When they returned to Boston, their reports were contradictory, evasive, and hollow. One declared Drummond harmless, another praised him as a genius, another resigned his post entirely. None dared write what they had truly seen, because to do so would mean confessing what they had become. Hadley remained a wound in Massachusetts, but no scalpel of reason could cut it out. The infection had proven stronger than intellect, stronger than doctrine, stronger than law. Science had entered the chamber confident it could diagnose the disease, and instead emerged carrying it. For those who watched from the shadows, the lesson was clear. Drummond's methods could not be explained because they were not accidents. They were deliberate, engineered with precision. And worse still, they could spread not just in villages but in cities, in institutions, in nations. The scholars came to end him. They left as the first proof that his system was not local, it was universal. By the late 1820s, Hadley was no longer spoken of as a town but as a cautionary tale. Families abandoned their homes. Fields lay fallow, churches stood hollowed, and the academy itself became a husk, its shutters nailed shut, though its foundation still breathed. And yet, Ezekiel Drummond remained. His body aged, but his system did not. The man who once taught rhetoric and persuasion was no longer seen in public. Still, his influence grew. Former students, those who had survived his presence, drifted outward into Boston, New Haven, even New York. They carried nothing in their hands, no texts, no manifestos, yet something traveled with them. A discipline, a method, an infection that wore the disguise of reason. In courtrooms, men began winning cases not with evidence, but with presence. In pulpits, sermons bent entire congregations into silence, their eyes locked, their wills suspended. In political halls, debates no longer ended with compromise but with surrender. Everywhere his pupils went, patterns emerged, the same unraveling of resistance, the same hollowing of individuality, the same quiet substitution of will with obedience. Drummond himself was rumored to be writing journals, treatises, instructions. None were ever published, but fragments slipped through the cracks. A coded letter intercepted in New Haven, a page of formulas found inside a burned house, a series of strange exercises whispered of in Yale's dormitories. Whether these were truly his work or imitations hardly mattered. The seed had already taken root. By the 1830s, Hadley's story was invoked in private circles, not as a warning, but as a blueprint. What Drummond achieved in one valley, a Boston magistrate wrote anonymously, might be scaled to a nation, and so his methods spread not openly, but beneath the surface, disguised as pedagogy, as jurisprudence, as theology. By mid-century, entire institutions bore his fingerprints without naming him. Schools that no longer educated but conditioned. Churches that no longer preached salvation, but submission. Governments that discovered obedience could be engineered as efficiently as roads or bridges. Hadley had fallen silent long ago, yet its silence echoed louder than any sermon. Drummond had ceased to be a professor or even a prophet. He had become something far more dangerous, a foundation stone. For in the centuries that followed, whenever masses were bent to a single will, whenever individuality dissolved into collective surrender, whenever entire nations acted as one body at the command of one voice, some whispered that Hadley had never ended, that Drummond's science had simply changed its mask. And if the journals still exist, hidden in some library or private collection, they are not relics. They are blueprints, waiting. Hadley is gone now. The fields are overgrown. The academy is nothing but stone and shadow. No maps mark the town. No sermons mention its fall. It has been erased from memory. And yet, doesn't it feel familiar? Think of it. The lecture halls where words do not educate but condition. The screens that command your attention, not by force, but by the soft compulsion of repetition. The voices that fill every chamber of your day, whispering certainty until you forget to resist. You know their power, don't you? You felt it. The surrender so subtle you convince yourself you chose it. Hadley did not vanish. It multiplied. Drummond's journals were not relics. They were rehearsal. A rehearsal for something you are already inside. For a design that does not need his hand anymore because it has yours. Every time you share, repeat, obey without thought, you extend his reach. And now, even in this moment, as you sit here listening, as your breath stills, as the room around you quiets, do you feel it? That silence? That weight pressing behind your eyes? The same silence that settled over Hadley when the bells tolled empty. The same silence that spread when families laid down their wills. It is here again. Not history, not myth, not warning. A system, a science, a design that has already found you. And now the only question left is this. Do you still believe you're the one watching the story? Or are you certain the story isn't watching you? Listen close. If what you felt tonight stirred something in you, something restless, dangerous, hungry, do not let it die in silence. Make it real. Declare your line. Anchor the change. Below, in the comments, type the phrase, I answer the silver voice. Type it once. Then type it again. Twice. Let the repetition be the seal. Let those 2 words mark the moment you stopped being merely curious and chose to know. Do it now, 2 entries back to back. Say it like a pact. Say it like a key. Then subscribe. Not because you want another story, but because you want the map. Hit the bell. Join the ones who refuse to sleep while power works in shadow. Share this with one man who needs to see what you see, not to scare him, but to arm him. If you commented the phrase twice, leave one line below that says where you stand now, city or state. I'll read. We are building a quiet ledger of those who remember. Those who do not flinch. This channel pulls no punches. We unmask, we name, and we teach how to resist. If you're ready to walk deeper, stay. If not, close the door. But if you are ready, repeat with deliberate intent. I answer the silver voice. I answer the silver voice. Do it. Subscribe. Walk with us. The descent is dangerous and it changes a man forever.